We've all experienced those individuals in our lives, whether it be friends or family members or even co-workers, employers, to politicians. We've all heard them say, trust me. I know what I'm doing. You can trust me. Only to be hurt in the end. And the reality is, the truth is that there's only one that we can truly trust in, and that is God himself. And in our last few weeks, or last while, we've been going through the book of Acts, and we've been seeing Paul's missionary journeys and the things that take place in Paul's journeys that reveals how he was able to trust in God every step of the way. Even through the hard times, he was able to trust in God. The last couple of weeks, we've been looking at how Paul had come to Jerusalem to bring an offering to the church in Jerusalem. And he arrives there, and it causes a ruckus in the town to where people come against him, wanting to kill him. And a Roman commander came to his aid and saved his life. But as that commander is leading Paul to safety, Paul asks that commander if they can stop so he can talk to the crowd that's trying to kill him. And so he has that opportunity to share, and the Jewish people, they receive his message until he begins talking about Gentiles, non-Jewish people. Then a riot begins again, and they try to kill him again. And so this Roman commander takes him to safety. And he's escorted into the barracks by the Roman guards. But one thing that Paul could do, and one thing that we can do as well, is always trust in God's influence, or trust in his sovereignty. God is in control of everything, whether we realize it or not. And we can trust in that influence. We can trust in that sovereignty, because when Paul, or when the Roman commander took Paul into the barracks into safety, we read in Acts 22, verse 30, it says, the commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews. So the next day he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the members of the Sanhedrin to assemble. Then he brought Paul and had him stand before them. So here was Paul. He was able to share his message with the people in the city, but they began to riot. And because of that riot, he's being taken to safety, and he's given another opportunity to share with the crowds that were trying to kill him. And he shares his message again. And he says something that causes yet another riot. And so the commander of the Roman guards take him to safety. But that Roman commander wanted to know why. Why were people getting so upset with Paul? So this commander ordered that the chief priests and the Sanhedrin come together to hear what Paul had to say. So Paul went from the temple to the crowds to the religious leaders of the day. That wasn't necessarily his plan to go speak to the religious leaders, but this Roman commander made it happen because of God's influence, God's sovereignty. That's what God wanted him to preach that message or share that message with those religious leaders. And so Paul is given that chance. And not only to the religious leaders, as we will see at the end of this passage, he's also given a promise by God to go to Rome to share with the political leaders of the day. And so God was making it all happen, even though it wasn't the way maybe Paul wanted it to go. But God was making it happen. And that shows God's influence, his sovereignty. And we have to understand, our God is sovereign. He is in charge. He has complete influence over all things, over all mankind. And if he wants us to speak to certain people, he's going to make it happen. If he wants us to go to certain parts of our community, our state, our country, our world, he's going to make that happen. Now, we need to do our part. If we have that desire to go talk to somebody, we need to make those plans. We need to schedule those visits. We need to prepare what it is we want to say. But maybe there will be times where we won't be able to make it to those places that we desire to get to. But we have to understand too, or trust that God's going to make it happen. If he wants us to go to those places and talk to those people, it'll happen. If that's not in his plan, it's not going to happen. But we can trust in his influence. We can trust in his sovereignty that he's going to put us in the places where he wants us to be the most effective for him. Along with trusting in his influence, number 2, we need to trust in God's message, the message that he gives to us to share with others. We get to Acts chapter 23. Paul's in front of the council, in front of these religious leaders, and it says, Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day." At this, the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck." Those who were standing near Paul said, "How dare you insult God's high priest?" Paul replied, "Brothers, I did not realize that he was the high priest, for it is written, 'Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people.'" Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and others Pharisees, called out to the Sanhedrin, "My brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead." When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, and that there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees believe all these things. There was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood up and argued vigorously. "We find nothing wrong with this man," they said. "What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him?" And so, when given the chance to speak, God gave Paul the words to share. And maybe he didn't even think of it as being God's words. I mean, he just said, "My brothers," there was commonality there because he grew up, or he was a Pharisee. He was a religious leader at one point. And he says, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day." And that was truth to him. He believed that, and he was doing what God was wanting him to do. But as a result of that comment, he's struck by those in attendance, to which he replies again, "God strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourselves violate the law by commanding that I be struck." So Paul knew what to say. God gave him those words to say. His years of study of the law helped him in this case. But God brought those words to mind to where he was able to defend himself in front of those religious leaders. And when he's corrected that, hey, you don't strike the high priest, he responds, "Brothers, I didn't realize that he was the high priest." Paul had been out of the area for years and years, so he probably did not know who the high priest was. And then he quotes scripture again, "For it is written, 'Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people.'" And so he did exactly what scripturally what he was supposed to do. And then he goes on, and God gives him this, I guess an idea would be my guess, where he says, "My brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead." He was in that assembly, and he realized there were Sadducees there, and there were Pharisees, two different religious leader groups. And he knew that the Pharisees, they believed in the resurrection, and the Sadducees, they did not believe in the resurrection. And so he says, I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead. God gave him those words which caused that the friction within that council, to where they argued against each other. And and Paul, when he went into that situation, he could have had a perfected message to share. But the situation led to a different type of message. Instead of a polished sermon, Paul revealed truth about the religious leaders. You're supposed to be judging me on this, but you're doing this against the law. And he also was able to incite that division, confusing the leaders to where they fought against each other, to the point where the Pharisees say, hey, we see nothing wrong with this guy and the message that he's giving. But it was God that gave him those words to say at that time. And we can trust that God's going to do that. We can trust in God's message, what he gives to us at that time. In Matthew chapter 10, Jesus says, be on your guard. And he's talking to his his disciples there. He says, you will be handed over to the local councils and be flogged in the synagogues. On my account, you will be brought before governors and kings as witness to them and to the Gentiles. But when they arrest you, do not worry about what to say or how to say it. For it will not be you speaking, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. And so trusting that God is going to give us the words to say at the right time. He is sovereign. He has influence over all things. And when we come before people, trust that he's going to give us the message to share. We can prepare what we want to say, but God's going to give us the words at that time. And along with trusting in that influence and trusting in his message, number 3, we need to trust in God's protection. Chapter 23, verse 10. He's in the synagogue, or he's in this council, and he shares with them, and he incites that division. And then in verse 10, it says, the dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. And a couple sad things there is the fact that these were the religious leaders, and the dispute became so violent that this commander thought Paul was going to be torn to pieces by these religious leaders. That's a sad state for those religious leaders. But the truth is still there that God was protecting Paul. He had work for Paul to do. Paul, again, was found in this position of being torn to pieces by the religious leaders. And once again, it's that Roman commander that steps in, comes to his aid, and protects him from them. And the truth is, we can trust in God's protection as we go through our lives as well. God will place people in our lives to help us in our time of need. And I know I've shared this before. There are some that believe that they're basically invincible. As children of God, as servants of God, that they are invincible. They believe that God will protect them no matter what. As they're going into the mission field and they're going to share the gospel message, that they have absolutely no fear. Because as they're doing God's work, he's going to allow us to do his work until our time is done. He knows when our last breath is going to be taken. And so we can serve him in such a way that to not fear, because he is going to protect us. Now, that doesn't give us a license to just be flippant in our activities, to go to the dangerous places, and not being thoughtful of our actions. But there is some truth to the fact that God knows when our days will be coming to an end. He knows the work that he has given us to do, and he's going to be with us every step of the way until the day we die. And so there is that fact that he will protect us. as we serve him, because he has certain work, a certain job for all of us to do. And as we trust in that protection, number 4, we need to trust in God's timing. And this is tough. Trusting in God's timing. Verse 11 of chapter 23, it says, the following night, so after all that Paul had gone through with those religious leaders, the following night the Lord stood near Paul and said, so here was the Lord himself coming next to Paul to encourage him, to strengthen him. And he says, take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome. And so God had given Paul that leading of that promise that he was going to be going to Rome. Now, Paul had desired to make a trip to Rome, I believe, for years. That was his plan. That was what he was wanting to do. He wanted to have the part in building up the church in Rome. And we read in his missionary journeys that there were many times Paul planned on going to different places, different regions, but we're told that the Spirit stopped him. It wasn't time for him to go to that area yet. And so he was stopped. And kind of the same way that going to Rome, that he was stopped from going to Rome by the Spirit or by the things that took place. God was orchestrating how all this was going to happen. And for Paul, he wanted to go to Rome to be a witness for Christ in that city, but he wanted to go on his own. But we will, as we continue on, we learn that he ends up going to Rome as a prisoner. But he still gets there. It's in God's timing and it's in God's way. And the importance of trusting in that, in God and in those circumstances, that he's going to make things happen in his time and in his way. Not the way we want things done, but the way he wants them done. Here we see that the trials that Paul faced in Jerusalem, his opportunities with the crowds turning into riots, his message to the religious leaders turning into a death trap for him. And then that following night, Paul receives that visit from the Lord. Take courage. You've testified about me in Jerusalem, but you're going to testify about me in Rome as well. Paul was going to make it to Rome. Not in his timing, not in his way, but God gave him the promise of its fulfillment. And we have to understand, and it's hard, I understand that, to trust in God's timing. His timing is always perfect. It may not seem perfect from our point of view. It may not be what we want or how we want it to happen, but it will be exactly what God wants at exactly the time God wants it to be. Do we trust him enough to believe that? Will we trust in God throughout our lives, our day-to-day lives? Do we trust that he is sovereign and he will accomplish everything he has planned for us? Will we trust that he will give us the words to say at the right time when given the opportunity to share about our faith? Will we trust that he will help us through each and every obstacle that we face? The protection that we need as we go through this life. And will we trust that he will complete his work in us and through us at just the right time? We serve an awesome God, a God that we can trust with our everything. Will we trust him with our lives today? God bless. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.